On Dispatches tonight, the most toxic man-made substance on Earth. It's getting into the food chain, but the people who are meant to protect us seem powerless to act. In tonight's Dispatch, reporter Brenda Rowe goes in search of dioxin. What exactly is it, and how much is getting into our bodies? She reveals this secret map of Britain, more than 20 locations where dioxin is now giving real cause for concern. That's Dispatches, tracing dioxin from the womb to a mother's milk, a trail that includes city incinerators and one of the country's most respected companies. The first nationwide investigation into the perfect poison.
ICI in Runcorn, Cheshire, Britain's biggest chemical company. For almost 30 years, ICI has been dumping millions of tons of toxic waste in the nearby lagoons. But Runcorn isn't the only place ICI is dumping it. This is ICI's massive toxic waste dump near Northwich, only 10 miles from Runcorn. ICI security tried to prevent us from filming.
Sorry, can I help you?
Yeah, I work for ICI, but I'm not the press officer, so I can't speak to you about it.
In the waste ICI dumps is dioxin. In its pure form, the most toxic man-made chemical ever known.
Dioxin is a very persistent substance. It probably lasts for centuries, but certainly for decades. In a way, it's sort of perfect poison.
New research is fueling a heated debate about how little dioxin it takes to cause us serious harm.
Most of us are consuming foods that have dioxins in them. The dioxins sort of get onto vegetation. They're produced in a whole variety of processes. They're in the air, they settle out on the grass, animals graze the grass, and the dioxins then enter the meat that people eat, and also get into milk and cream and various dairy products.
Dairy products alone now give us a third of our dioxin intake from food. This is what MAF, the Agriculture Ministry, is concerned about. Tonight, Dispatches can reveal that both Runcorn and Northwich are two places on a secret government list of at least 23 dioxin hotspots. The ministry have to check if dioxins are entering the food chain, so they're testing milk at all these locations. Russell and Eileen Merkin's farm is in another of these hotspots.
We've got 56 acre, just over, and it were a dairy farm, till MAF stopped us milking. And they came one day and said, we've dioxin in his milk, and we can't take any more milk.
When they walked in, they said, do you know anything about dioxins? So we said, no, we've never heard anything. So they said, well, your milk's been tested, and you have found that there's levels of dioxin in your milk that shouldn't be there, and your milk cannot be marketed.
One day you're happily milking away, you know, next day you're finished. It's just as simple as that.
It wasn't just the cows that were affected. The farmers too had absorbed high levels of dioxins. The ministry offered Eileen and Russell the chance of checking on their own health.
Well, they said we could have a blood test, which we took up after, I think it was about a year after we had the blood test.
What were the levels of dioxin in you?
About 2.5 times more than what should be.
Dioxins have only existed in any quantity for about a century. Levels started increasing about the same time as the chlorine industry began. Salt is made up of sodium and chlorine. Industry needs sodium to make things like soap and glass. So it splits the sodium from the salt, but that leaves chlorine, a very toxic gas. Industry uses this to make solvents and PVC.
We're still putting chlorine into products, including one of the most nasty of all, although it looks so harmless, is PVC.
Dioxins are the unintentional byproduct of making solvents and PVC plastic.
It's part of our throwaway society. Plastic bags, plastic spoons, throwaway razors, apart from a lot of the things that are actually in our homes.
PVC also makes dioxin at the end of its life.
When that substance is burnt in a medical waste incinerator, in a solid waste incinerator, or in a house fire, any fire, then it produces dioxins.
Dioxins build up gradually in tiny amounts, but pose a danger that far outweighs their minute size.
Just to show how toxic dioxin is, these 2 tablets, if they were made of dioxin, would contain the maximum tolerable lifetime dose for every man, woman and child in the whole of Britain. That's according to the latest American and European research.
There is growing scientific concern about dioxins. Paper after paper now conclude that there is no safe level for dioxin exposure. Numerous studies have demonstrated a link between dioxins and cancer, but medical evidence is also mounting of links between dioxins and other problems, liver disease, heart attacks, neurological and, most worrying, reproductive problems. Dioxins may be affecting men's fertility. Sperm levels in industrial societies are falling drastically, by up to 50% since the 1940s. We know that lower sperm counts in animals can be caused by dioxins, and there's now growing concern that they're having the same effect in humans. Dioxins, if unchecked, could ultimately lead to our extinction. The US Environmental Protection Agency has brought out a draft document on dioxins. Its conclusions are supported by most of the world's foremost independent dioxin specialists, including Paul Connett. He's British, but works in America.
Dioxins are the most potent dysregulators of human chemistry that we've ever studied.
The Americans recommend a tolerable daily intake more than 1,000 times lower than Britain's level.
The average person in Britain is getting a dose of dioxins which is very close to where you'd expect to see effects in animals. That's the average person. It means in this essence you've shifted the whole population across because you're putting into their bodies chemicals which make it more difficult for them to fight off disease, more likely to get cancer, more likely to get reproductive problems, more likely to get neurological problems, behavioral problems.
Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Pollution, HMIP, disagree with the Americans. HMIP prefer to rely on older data from British experts.
The UK experts have in fact formed a view on them and said that the dioxin levels in the UK, the levels being taken into the body by ingestion, in particular in food, are not such as to cause concern.
They don't seem to have taken much of it into account, particularly the more recent research on the non-cancer effects of dioxin. And in the end, we have this 1,000-fold discrepancy between what the United States consider to be an acceptable daily intake and what the UK consider to be an acceptable daily intake, and that is puzzling.
The Ministry's secret hotspot list includes towns throughout the country, from the south coast to the industrial centres of the Midlands, to the former mill towns of Yorkshire. Many of them have one thing in common: incinerators. There are now hundreds of incinerators across the country, which burn everything from domestic and clinical waste to sewage sludge. Government policy has been to encourage incineration as the best way to deal with waste. Most incinerator dioxin comes from burning PVC plastic. According to HMIP, incinerators are Britain's biggest single source of airborne dioxin. Many have been allowed to discharge excessive amounts for years. Dioxins from this incinerator at Huddersfield were measured at 187 times the legal limit.
I think it's very crude chemistry. You're literally burning everything that society makes. And to come up with one machine that can burn everything together and control the emissions is, I think, wishful thinking.
Despite the government's awareness of incinerator emissions, it's taken tough new European legislation to force them to set lower limits. Most incinerators will have to close by the end of next year. But this could be too late. The dioxins they've emitted for years have already fallen to ground and entered the food chain. Dispatches wanted to find out just how much dioxin is already in our bodies at background levels. Are there dioxins even in unborn babies? We asked Dr. Vivian Howard of Liverpool University Hospital to find out.
We've had some fetal tissue analysed from the northwestern region. This is the first time we've measured these things in the UK.
The results from average areas, not just high dioxin locations, were shocking. They established that dioxins are present even in the first stage of life.
It's quite clear that these substances are already present in the womb, in the baby, while it's forming. The fetus, if you take the British level, is taking in twice as much on average as it should be. And if you take the American level of acceptability, it's about 2,000 times too much.
Dr. Howard thinks this could have serious implications.
The most vulnerable time of your life is when you're forming in the womb. If you start to disrupt hormone levels of the fetus while it's in the womb, particularly of the sex hormones such as testosterone, then you are likely to produce permanent deformity.
But perhaps the most chilling irony is that the best way that women can rid themselves of dioxins is by breastfeeding.
The most efficient way of getting rid of dioxin from your body is to lactate and produce milk. That does get rid of quite a lot of dioxin. And there is evidence that the firstborn in the family does get more via this route than the more subsequent the children.
Breastfeeding a baby can give it more than 20 times the background level of dioxin. In fact, breastfed babies get up to 1/10 of their tolerable lifetime dose in their first year. Yet babies are much more vulnerable to damage from dioxins than adults.
In Germany, we've had pediatricians tell women to limit their breastfeeding to 3 or 4 months because of their concerns about dioxin.
The UK government says it has no intention of changing its advice to breastfeeding mothers.
When you tell a woman to limit her breastfeeding, it's a very radical thing to do. It's far less draconian, far less radical to take the chlorine out of the bleaching of paper, to take the chlorine out of the chemical industry, to not build incinerators.
Dioxins are also concentrating in Britain's seas and rivers and in the fish that swim in them. Fish are at the top of a very long food chain, so we get up to 1/3 of our dioxin intake from eating fish. Dioxin levels in the Mersey were recently found to be amongst the highest in Britain, yet more than half the fish caught here are eaten.
Not a bad little bag of eels we've got. Some of the lads actually do eat them and they smoke them. They're very tasty apparently. It's quite a decent one. You can jelly them or whatever, but I think smoking's the most popular. Some of the lads do that. Nice little eel.
Just upstream along the Mersey estuary lies the ministry hotspot of Runcorn in Cheshire. On the other side of the river is quiet, elegant Frodsham. Most residents are unaware that the ICI chemical works, only a few hundred yards away, are pouring toxic waste into open, unlined lagoons. Local people walk on rights of way to within yards of them. The River Weaver flows past the ICI works, which dispose of 1.2 million tonnes of toxic waste into the 2 lagoons every year. If ICI applied for a licence for them today, it wouldn't be granted.
Western Marsh Lagoon is an outdated and very crude method of dealing with the discharges it receives. The discharges it's received are amongst the most harmful substances licensed as I say, in the European Union. It's basically a hole in the ground which is designed to leak, and it does leak.
It was designed to leak into the ground and discharge straight into the canal and the river. It was government policy at that time to disperse waste by diluting it down. But we now know it's also reaching the aquifer.
It's an appalling way to have actually got rid of waste over this number of years. And although maybe when they started 30 years ago they had not so much idea about how toxic these substances are, certainly for the last decade it's been quite clear that we're dealing with a highly poisonous set of substances.
3 years ago, ICI tried to reassure one local activist by writing to her.
ICI has not found any source of dioxins into the local environment.
But Dispatches has found out that 18 months later, ICI wrote to HMIP here in Warrington. In their document, they admitted that they were producing and dumping dioxins in huge quantities. ICI fought to keep this information secret. They exploited a loophole so they could avoid putting the document on the public register. But now they've been forced to disclose this damaging information. Tonight we can reveal for the first time that ICI's document admits to dumping large amounts of dioxin in 2 sites in Cheshire. ICI also admits dioxin is getting into the local waterways and that high levels of dioxin are in soil near a housing estate. HMIP has had this report for 2 years.
How has it happened that ICI has been allowed to dump toxic waste into an unlined lagoon for 30 years?
It is an operation whose very nature is subject to control by other regulatory authorities under the legislation. HMIP does not have the responsibility in that area.
But why was HMIP asking ICI to make this report on its discharges if they aren't responsible? There seems to be confusion amongst the different regulators about who's responsible for what. HMIP is in charge of all waste generated from ICI's plant, including airborne emissions. But the instant waste lands in the lagoons, it becomes the responsibility of Cheshire Waste Regulatory Authority. It's still theirs in the overflow pipe. That is, until the moment it hits the surface of the canal or the river, when it passes to the National Rivers Authority. Frodsham's water ski and sailing clubs use the river a little way upstream of ICI. ICI also admitted dioxin is released into the Western Canal, which flows into the river and out into the Mersey. Despite this, HMIP didn't hand the report on to the authority that deals with pollution in the river, the National Rivers Authority. Mike Matthews worked for the NRA at the relevant time.
The report would have been submitted just after I left, but having talked to the inspector, it's certain that she didn't actually see the report and that it's obviously sat on somebody's desk.
The report was given to the Cheshire Waste Regulatory Authority, the third body with responsibility for the site.
We've been working with HMIP and the NRA since 1990 to see the closure of this particular site. And we have no difficulty in communicating information backwards and forwards to each other.
Did you know that, in fact, the NRA have never seen ICI's report on the level of contaminants on that site? They never set eyes on it until we supplied it to them.
Well, I'm surprised.
When Mike Matthews was at the NRA, he was responsible for ICI's discharges into the River Weaver. He initiated some changes.
One of the minor improvements that we had done in my time of policing this site was actually put a ditch in around the entire length of the lagoon. We can see part of it along here where the little green pumping station is. That was to pick up material that you could actually see leaking out across the sort of area towards the river. It picks up a percentage of it, it picks up what's visible, but the vast majority of the contamination is actually going down into the aquifer and into the river that way. You do still see, however, in certain areas the grass hasn't recovered, and you have to get up to quite high levels of contamination to kill grass off like that.
HMIP and Cheshire Waste Regulatory Authority have decided to make ICI decommission the lagoon. It will take 10 years to dry out. Mike Matthews believes he saw last summer the sort of problems that will occur.
When the lagoons dry out in summer, there's a fair amount of sedimentary particles, very fine sand and silt, gets blown across the lagoon. If you let this dewater without putting some sort of cap on, then you're going to get sediments contaminated with dioxins and all other sorts of nasties blowing around the local environs.
And will it pose a danger to people living around here?
I can't see how the actual lagoon itself, which is quite a large structure, is going to be dealt with other than being left in situ. I hate to use the term toxic time bomb, it's one that's often overused, but certainly behind us there we've got all the makings of something that's got to be there and managed for generations to come.
What is going to happen when it dries out and the dioxins could be emitted through the air back down to land? Does it then become your responsibility?
No, it doesn't. Our responsibilities are to do with particular defined industrial processes, with the emissions from those processes. They are defined in law.
But this is a nonsense. The waste has come from the industrial process. It's been put in the land. It's going to dry out on your instructions that they're going to leave the Western Marsh Lagoon to dry out and no more dumping must take place. And then the dioxins will be airborne, and it's still not your responsibility.
Under the law, we have responsibilities which are closely defined. Our responsibilities are in respect of emissions from the process per se.
Dispatches asked ICI for an interview. They declined. But in a statement, they told us that they do not treat the issue of dioxins lightly. ICI went on to say,
ICI is currently commissioning a £50 million environmental improvement project at Runcorn, which will eliminate our dioxin discharge to Western Marsh Lagoon.
But 30 years of contamination may already be out in the environment. Cattle graze the adjoining fields. 18 months ago, the Agriculture Ministry expressed concern about the magnitude of ICI's dioxin releases. They asked HMIP to get ICI to test local cow's milk. ICI noted the comment, nothing more was done, and the whole matter was dropped. So Dispatches commissioned Dr. Vivian Howard to supervise some more dioxin tests, this time on soil samples from fields around the ICI plant. The results were to prove alarming. Dispatches wanted to know if dioxin had got into the food chain around ICI. We asked local farmers if we could test milk from their cows for dioxin. They refused, fearing their farms might be closed. So we asked Vivian Howard to supervise the taking of soil samples from fields around the plant. The dioxin content is measured in parts per trillion. The average background level in the UK, which some scientists already think is very high, is 3.3. The previous worst for dioxin-contaminated soil in the UK was 54. ICI's own readings near Runcorn measured 53. Yet referring to these figures, ICI claimed in their statement,
Levels have been found to be normal, and we believe that there is no possibility of these discharges getting into the food chain.
Yet our samples taken from around their plant measured over 115, more than twice the worst previous reading in the UK.
There were several soil samples taken, one from this field in the background here, and this particular result is quite interesting because it had 115 parts per trillion.
Results at half that level elsewhere had led to farms being closed.
It is at a level which is rather higher than was used to stop milk production.
What did HMIP think of our soil tests?
HMIP has no reason to believe that emissions are coming from the process such as would result in the contamination that you are describing. It is an industrial area, and dioxins have been being produced over many years from all sorts of processes. Bonfires, for example, are a source of dioxin.
We're talking about massive amounts of dioxins that ICI has admitted to. We're not talking about dioxins of the level caused by a bonfire. What has HMIP done about that?
HMIP has no involvement with that lagoon. The responsibility for that lagoon is not HMIP's. But the bottom line of the position is that these dioxins in that location are not seen to be threatening the food chain.
The laboratory that did these tests in Germany advised me that if they found levels like this in Germany, then they would consider removing the topsoil as contaminated. They certainly wouldn't allow any food production to go on it.
What do you think ought to be done now in light of those samples?
Well, I feel there should be a full government inquiry.
In the ICI's case, do you think you've protected the public?
I'm very confident that we have protected the public so far as our responsibilities go, that we have protected them in a proper manner.
It's not only soil that's causing serious concern. Another hotspot involves river sediment near Bolsover. The River Dowlee. Today, the National Rivers Authority regularly tests the river for contaminants. In 1991, they found the highest levels of dioxins ever recorded from a British river, 2,000 times higher than in streams feeding it. They considered excavating the whole riverbed, then they shelved the plan. Dioxin levels in the river sediment are now 1/20th of what they were in 1991, but that's still very high.
At the present moment, they're about 5 to 50 times higher than the level we would normally expect in a river of this nature.
What has the NRA done to clean this river up?
What the NRA has done is we looked into the possibilities of minimising the effects, and we set up a project specifically with this, and we looked into many different ways of cleaning up the dioxins from the river. But at the end of that research, we came back to the conclusion that the best and safest option was to allow the river to clean itself up naturally.
Well, if they're saying that the River Dowlee will clean itself up of dioxins, what they're really referring to is the fact that the chemicals are likely to be washed further downstream. So they're not going to be as concentrated, if you like. They're just going to be diluted and dispersed.
So where have they gone?
Until we have the results of the further monitoring, I can't answer that accurately.
Where do you think they've gone?
They have obviously gone downstream, but the levels at which they have gone downstream we do not know, and they will be much lower than they are here.
And the dioxin continues to be swept downstream.
Which means it's going to end up further down the river or indeed out in the North Sea, where again it will be available for uptake and bioconcentration in the food chain.
Next April, the 3 regulating agencies will cease to exist. They'll be replaced by a new quango, the Environment Agency. But already there are fears that this will be no more effective than its predecessors. Under its statute, it must consider industry's costs before insisting they clean up their pollution.
The bill remains fatally flawed. The cost-benefit duties imposed on the agencies fundamentally undermine their central purpose and their aim. We have seen commercial interests actually being set ahead of the interests of the environment.
One of the biggest challenges to face this new quango is a problem the existing agencies have so far failed to grasp. Castle Cement in Clitheroe. Local people are concerned it might be an increasing source of dioxins. Some cement kilns have recently been licensed to burn toxic waste. But who will be monitoring the dioxins that result?
Cement kilns are designed to make cement. If something goes wrong when you're making cement, it's no big deal. You waste some lime. But if something goes wrong when you're making cement and you're burning hazardous waste at the time, it's a serious problem.
Here in Clitheroe, Castle Cement have been burning a toxic waste they call semfuel for 2 years. Locals claim the smoke plume from the chimney regularly engulfs surrounding land.
I can taste it quite often, and I'll find that I have a very sore throat for perhaps 24 hours afterwards, and very itchy eyes. It makes your eyes itch.
But the owners of the kiln say it's nothing to do with semfuel.
Are you saying that people's health and itchy eyes are not related to what you're doing here?
I'm saying that the evidence from all the testing around the plant by other people, not just by us, is that our operations are not damaging anybody's health.
Clitheroe is another location on the Agriculture Ministry's dioxin hotspot list. They tested the milk on the Collinsons' farm last summer. The results were quite high for a rural area. But strangely, they decided not to classify Clitheroe as rural.
They said that as the milk was going wholesale and was being diluted with everyone else's milk at a large dairy, the amount of dioxins in it didn't matter anyway. It would be diluted down in the total supply.
And what do you think about that?
I think it's coming to a pretty pass when they have to dilute somebody's milk down.
The Collinsons are concerned that the dioxins in their milk may be connected to smoke from the kiln. But as things stand, they're unlikely to find out. It seems that the new agency will only be able to insist on dioxin monitoring twice a year. The company will do its own testing, with the Environment Agency only spot checking.
We have to rely on measurements made, usually under ideal circumstances, usually when the company knows it's being monitored.
Will the new agency still be relying on industry to police themselves?
The system is one of them having responsibilities and the inspectorate being charged with ensuring that they deliver their responsibilities, just as the inspectorate does now.
The new agency will have the additional responsibility of policing contaminated land sites and making the polluter pay to clean up. But as with emissions to air, they will have to take costs and commercial interests into consideration, which makes the last of the ministry's hotspots potentially the most worrying of all. Northwich is next door to ICI's biggest underground toxic dump. Dispatches found it just down the road. For 27 years, thousands of tons of liquid waste have been buried here. Within the waste, by ICI's own admission, is 500 times more dioxin than at Western Marsh Lagoon.
Hello.
Phil Richardson, a consultant geologist, has studied the site.
Where we are now is in the middle of an area known as the Holford Brine Field, and in all directions where we stand now, unseen to us, are large caverns below the surface, a whole series of 3 to 350 metre high cavities. These are the same kinds of volumes as maybe St Paul's Cathedral, but the potential problem,
We were about to discover how keen ICI were to dissuade us from filming.
Sorry, can I help you?
Yeah, I work for ICI, but I'm not the press officer, so I can't speak to you.
Another security car turns up.
Can we help you? Yes, we're doing filming here on public right-of-way, as I understand. No, it's private property. There's a public right-of-way sign down there. Yeah, we might get the manager, I think.
Yeah.
All right.
A third car arrives.
Morning.
Morning.
I'm from ICI.
Yes.
And this is ICI property, so...
We understood that it was a walkway, public right-of-way.
It probably is a public right-of-way as well, yeah.
Well, we are allowed to walk down it then, surely?
Yes.
Fine.
So as I say, since 1968, ICI in this area have disposed of somewhere in excess of 330,000 tonnes of these toxic residues. This material is dangerous forever.
ICI are dumping 0.5 kilo of dioxin a year. ICI claims that dumping here is geologically safe and relies on the sealing qualities of salt underground to prevent toxins escaping.
The degree of containment offered by these licensed cavities ensures that there is no environmental impact from this disposal route.
Phil Richardson disagrees. He says there are layers of clay and other minerals between the underground salt layers. Further fractures may be caused by subsidence, which we know creates the typical pools of brackish water called flashes throughout the area. It's along these fractured surfaces and layers, he says, that toxic waste can be squeezed out into the surrounding land.
The potential problems are that this material can actually migrate laterally along these. Here you are in an area that it is known that water migrates from this area over fairly long periods of time and actually issues out into the Irish Sea. Now, if that kind of thing happens, then we really are in trouble.
But how would we know whether it's moving or not?
Well, under normal circumstances, you would expect that there would be detailed monitoring. Unfortunately, my reading of the working plan that ICI have developed for this area, there is very little actual monitoring takes place.
Cheshire Waste Regulatory Authority, with an eye to its merger into the new Quango, is concerned enough about possible leakage to have ordered ICI to monitor groundwater around the site. Again, they'll rely on ICI to carry out the tests themselves.
Effectively, we have ICI being told, get on with it, you tell us if anything's going wrong.
The philosophy of the new agency seems to be that industry can be relied on to police itself.
The success of the system does not depend on them putting their hands up. The success of the system depends on our skill and ability in enforcing and ensuring that if departures from the stated requirements are taking place, that they come to our attention, and you may be assured that in that circumstance we will take appropriate action.
If the monitoring is weak, if the enforcement is weak, then the regulations don't protect you. Without the monitoring, without the enforcement, the regulations mean nothing.
And so the dioxin time bomb will continue to tick. While some dioxins do come from other sources like car exhausts, increasingly scientists are telling the UK government it must tackle the chlorine industry in the interests of all our health.
There's no doubt that the long-term solution is to stop the production of chlorine and find alternatives. For most of the things that are produced by the organic chlorine industry, there are alternatives anyway.
It's up to the public to say, if you're clever enough to make these materials, you must be clever enough to dismantle them safely.